Rain swept over the hospital windows in soft, steady sheets, tapping like a quiet metronome against the glass. The world outside looked blurred, as if someone had smudged a charcoal sketch with the side of their hand. Inside room 413, the air was hushed, save for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the low hum of oxygen flowing through a nasal cannula. Claire Madsen sat at the bedside of Walter Ainsley, her gloved hand gently holding his. He'd been unconscious for hours, his once powerful frame now thin and still beneath the covers. Rumors circled among the staff about who he was: a shipping magnate, a recluse, a widower, a man who hadn't spoken to his children in over a decade. To Claire, he was a patient nearing the end. And that meant he was someone who deserved comfort, not curiosity. She had seen many die. She had watched life go quietly, with just a twitch of the fingers or a subtle shift in breath. But there was something different about Walter. There was a heaviness in the room, not just from impending death, but from everything he seemed to carry with him as he left this world. He stirred once barely and his eyes opened, not wide, just enough to catch hers. "You're not her," he rasped. Claire lined in. "No, I'm Claire, I'm your nurse, you're safe." His mouth trembled slightly as if he wanted to say something more. Instead, he gave a weak nod, his eyes never leaving hers. A few minutes later, the monitor flatlined. Claire's hand stayed in his until the charge nurse arrived. She never rushed these moments. A person's final breath was still a breath. It mattered. After he was taken away, Claire returned to her duties, changed the sheets, wrote up the report. She moved through the rest of her shift with quiet grace. She didn't cry for Walter. She rarely cried for any of them. But that night, when she returned to her apartment with its squeaky floorboards and the scent of chamomile tea steeping in her favorite mug, she thought about the way his hand had twitched in hers just before he passed, as though he had something left to say. 4 days later, a man in a charcoal suit showed up at the nurse's station, holding an envelope with Claire's name written in elegant, slanted ink. He didn't offer her a smile, just a brief nod and a quiet "Miss Madsen," before handing over the envelope and walking away. Inside was a letter, thick paper smelling faintly of lavender and old books. "Miss Claire Madsen, you held my father's hand when no one else would. For that, you are now part of something he left behind. Please come to Ainsley Estate on Friday at noon. There are matters of importance to discuss. Sincerely, Julian Ainsley." Claire read the letter 3 times, then she folded it neatly and placed it on her nightstand. The next day, she called in for personal leave, not entirely sure why. Friday came with pale sunlight and the scent of early spring in the air. A car arrived outside her building, a black sedan polished to a mirror shine, and a man with a driver's cap opened the door for her with stiff formality. The drive took 2 hours, winding through green hills and eventually arriving at the edge of a long gravel drive, flanked by wrought iron gates that opened slowly on their own. The estate was as grand as the name promised. Ivy crawled across the stone facade and tall windows reflected the sky in wide, silver panes. Claire stepped out of the car and felt the weight of the place settle on her shoulders. It didn't feel like a house, it felt like a secret. She was met at the door by a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, with a streak of gray at his temple. Julian Ainsley. "Miss Madsen," he said, offering his hand. His voice was low, precise. "Thank you for coming." Claire shook his hand. "You didn't give me much choice, Mr. Ainsley." A flicker of something passed through his expression, surprise maybe or the beginning of a smile, but it vanished before it fully arrived. "I won't keep you long, come with me." He led her through the main hall, past oil paintings and antique furniture, until they reached a sitting room with large windows that overlooked a garden of wild roses. The air in the room felt untouched, like no one had sat here in years. On the coffee table rested a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. Julian gestured to them. "My father left instructions. He said that if a nurse named Claire Madsen held his hand when he passed, this was to be given to her." Claire stared at the journal, uncertain. "Why?" "I don't know," Julian said. "My father wasn't a man who explained himself much, but he was deliberate, and he never gave anything away without a reason." Claire picked up the journal. The leather was worn, the corners softened with time. When she opened the first page, a photograph fell out. It was black and white, a young woman in a nurse's uniform, laughing beside a man who looked just like a younger Walter, less stern, more alive. On the back of the photo were 4 words in a delicate, cursive script. "She loved me back." Claire looked up. Julian had gone quiet, watching her. "I think he wanted you to know him," he said finally. She didn't reply. She was already turning the page. Claire sat in the sunlit room long after Julian had left her there, the journal open in her lap, the faint scent of aged paper lifting with each turned page. The handwriting was sharp and measured, like the man himself must have been once. But in the spaces between the words, there was something tender, hesitant, a man trying to make sense of the things he had lost. January 3rd, 1969, I saw her again today, Alina. It's been years since she left the ward, but she smiled at me like no time had passed. I should have said more. Instead, I stood there like a fool with a clipboard and watched her walk away, sunlight in her hair. I don't know what I would have said anyway. I loved you. I still do. I never stopped. Claire read silently, page after page. The entries skipped months at times, sometimes even years, but the same name wove through them all: Alina, a nurse, a woman he never stopped writing about. There were entries filled with longing, with regret, and then more rarely glimpses of moments they shared. A dance in the hospital courtyard after midnight, a letter she left in his coat pocket, the sound of her laugh when he spilled coffee on a patient chart. It was, Claire realized, not just a journal, but a record of a love he never outran. She didn't know why he had left it to her, only that when she read his words, she felt something stir in her own chest. Not grief exactly, but recognition. She had stood in similar doorways. She had held back words of her own. Later that afternoon, Julian returned with tea and a plate of lemon biscuits. "You're still here," he said, not surprised. Claire nodded. "Did your father ever talk about Alina?" Julian poured the tea, his movements precise. "Only once. He said there was a woman he should have fought for but didn't. He didn't say why." "Do you think she's still alive?" Julian looked out the window, thinking, maybe, but even if she is, I doubt she'd want anything to do with this place. Claire traced the rim of her cup with a fingertip. "He loved her, that's obvious. Even in his last moments, I think he thought I was her." Julian's gaze returned to her. "And you stayed anyway." "He was dying, that's not the kind of thing you walk away from." For the first time, something softened in his expression, not quite warmth but something adjacent, a quiet respect. "Stay the night," he said. "You've come all this way, and there's more I want to show you." Claire hesitated, but there was a pull she couldn't explain. "All right." The guest room she was given was more like a chamber from another century. High ceilings, velvet curtains, a fireplace that clicked and hissed as it came to life. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, the journal still in her hands. That night she couldn't sleep. The estate was too quiet, too heavy with memories that weren't hers. She rose sometime after midnight and wandered the halls. The portraits seemed to follow her, the faces solemn and proud. Down one corridor she found a locked door with a tarnished plaque, "E Chambers." She paused, her fingers brushing the doorknob, and wondered if Alina had once stood here too. She returned to bed just before dawn, slipping back beneath the quilt, and falling into a restless sleep filled with whispers and distant music. In the morning, Julian met her in the garden. He was already dressed in a dark overcoat, hair damp from dew. "There's something else," he said. "My father left a clause in his will, something strange." Claire followed him through the garden to a small greenhouse nestled between two hedgerows. It was overgrown but not abandoned. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the scent of rosemary and old soil. Julian picked up a folded document from a table and handed it to her. It bore the seal of the Ainsley family's lawyer. Claire scanned the paragraph, brow furrowing. If the nurse named Claire Madsen accepts the journal, she is to receive temporary stewardship over Ainsley estate for a period of 3 months. During this time, she may reside on the property, access the library and personal documents, and should she choose, pursue the whereabouts of Alina Blake. Julian watched her carefully. "I didn't even know her last name until I saw that." Claire blinked. "He wants me to find her." Julian nodded once, "And I think he knew you would try." A silence stretched between them, thick with things neither could name. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because you stayed," Julian said again, and this time there was no question in it. Claire stood in the greenhouse long after he'd gone, sunlight slanting in through the glass panes. She turned the journal over in her hands, and somewhere beneath the layers of duty and grief and habit, something inside her stirred awake. The search for Alina wouldn't be easy, but already she knew it wasn't just for Walter. It was for the girl she used to be, the one who had also let love slip past her. She would stay, she would look, she would read every word he left behind. Because something told her this story wasn't over. A week later, Claire found herself deep in the Ainsley library, surrounded by shelves of brittle letters, faded photographs, and ledgers cataloging decades of lives too carefully measured. She hadn't yet left the estate. Something about the air, the stillness of the place, compelled her to stay. There was no real logic to it, but each time she thought of returning to the city, she imagined Walter's thin fingers squeezing hers in those final seconds. As if something had passed between them then, something unresolved. She moved through the rooms with increasing familiarity now, her steps softer, more assured. The house no longer felt like a monument. It felt like a place waiting to be known. On a rainy Tuesday morning, she found a locked drawer in Walter's study. It was subtle, buried beneath correspondence and legal briefs, nearly invisible in the paneling. She hadn't been looking for it, only feeling her way through the shadows of a man who had written so desperately about a woman he never stopped loving. Julian helped her open it. He stopped asking questions about her choices, though he often lingered in doorways, watching her with a curiosity he didn't voice. Inside the drawer was a single file. Inside the file an address, Maple Hollow, a town 2 hours west, and a photograph, color this time, from the 1980s. A woman standing outside a bookshop, a paper cup in her hand, her smile unreadable but strikingly familiar. Claire turned the photo over. Eleanor, October 1987. She exhaled slowly. He found her. Julian looked over her shoulder, but he never went to her. I don't think he could, not after all that time. Why leave this now? Claire traced Eleanor's face with her gaze, then looked up, because he wanted someone to go who wouldn't be afraid to knock. She left the next morning before sunrise, Julian packing her a bag with thermos coffee and directions. The estate dog, an old golden retriever named Lyndon, followed her to the car and whined as she closed the door. Something about the way he watched her life felt like he knew more than he should. Maple Hollow was the kind of town that still swept its sidewalks and changed the window displays by hand. Claire found the bookshop on a corner just off Main Street. Its windows were dusted with age, the bell above the door ringing softly as she stepped inside. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair pulled into a loose twist. She wore a cardigan, the color of dried rose petals, and glasses that perched low on her nose. "Help you find something?" she asked, voice steady but cautious. Claire stepped closer. "Are you Eleanor Blake?" The woman's hand froze mid-shelving. She turned slowly. Her eyes, though lined with age, were striking, deep hazel and sharp. "Who's asking?" "I'm Claire Madsen. I'm a nurse. I was with Walter Ainsley when he passed." Eleanor's face barely changed, but her breath caught in a way that told Claire everything. "He wrote about you," Claire added, gently placing the journal on the counter. Eleanor stared at it, then shook her head faintly. He never did know when to stop writing. Claire opened the journal, flipping to the first entry. Eleanor's eyes moved across the words, her hand tightening slightly against the edge of the counter. "I thought he might have forgotten me," she whispered after a long pause. "No," Claire said, "not even close." They sat in the back of the shop for hours, surrounded by forgotten novels and the scent of old ink and tea. Eleanor spoke sparingly at first, but slowly her voice grew steadier. She told Claire about the years they'd worked together, how she had been young and certain, and how Walter had been too careful for his own good. They had loved each other once, quietly, in the kind of way that lives in glances and pauses, in the brush of hands while changing bed linens. "I left because I was tired of waiting for him to choose me," Eleanor said, "and he never came after me." "He did," Claire said softly, reaching into her coat, "just not then." She handed over the photograph Walter had kept, the one from 1987. Eleanor stared at it for a long time, her fingers trembling. Claire saw the tears well before they fell. "Stubborn man," Eleanor murmured. "He always did too little too late." Claire didn't argue. She just sat beside her, shoulder brushing gently against hers, giving space for grief to surface after years of keeping it pressed down. Before she left, Eleanor touched her wrist. "Thank you for being with him." Claire didn't know what to say to that. She only nodded. When she returned to the estate that evening, the sky had turned a soft lavender. Julian was waiting by the front steps, a book under his arm and a question in his eyes. "You found her." Claire nodded, stepping out of the car. She remembers everything, she just never got the chance to say it. Julian didn't ask what she meant. Instead, he offered her a half-smile, worn at the edges. "I've been thinking," he said. "My father left this house like a puzzle, like he wanted someone to put it back together." Claire looked at the windows above, and maybe someone to forgive him. Julian's gaze stayed on her. "Do you think that's possible?" Claire turned toward the garden where the roses had begun blooming again. "Maybe, but I don't think forgiveness is the end of the story." He nodded almost to himself. "Then what is?" Claire glanced back at him, beginning again. That night she didn't sleep in the guest room. She slept in Eleanor's old quarters, the door finally unlocked. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender, and the walls held a quietness that wasn't empty but waiting. In the dark, she listened to the wind move through the estate's eaves and thought of all the lives lived and left inside these walls. Her own had begun to change, she realized, not in leaps but in the quiet decision to stay, to listen, to search. Walter Ainsley had died in her hands, but somehow he had also passed something on, and now she was beginning to understand what it was. In the weeks that followed her return from Maple Hollow, Claire settled into the estate like someone discovering the shape of a life she hadn't known she could live. Morning light spilled through tall windows in golden waves. The old retriever, Lyndon, followed her from room to room as if appointed guardian of her quiet days. She still woke early, the nurse in her too deeply rooted to sleep past dawn, but instead of hospital corridors and medication charts, her mornings were filled with walks through dew-soaked fields and cups of tea brewed in an antique kettle that wheezed like it had stories of its own. Julian remained a steady presence, neither distant nor overly familiar. They shared meals at the long oak table, often in silence, sometimes in conversation that drifted into shared laughter. He had the kind of wit that revealed itself slowly, tucked beneath layers of reserve, but Claire found it comforting. There was something about the way he carried himself, like a man who had long ago stopped expecting to be surprised by anything, and was now discovering surprise could be a quiet kind of joy. She continued to read through Walter's journal. By now she'd finished it twice, but the pages still drew her back. There were things there that felt like keys to doors she hadn't yet found, entries about decisions left half-made, conversations with Julian as a boy, long drives in silence, and one mention of a letter Alina had written but never sent. Claire had not found the letter. It haunted her. On a humid afternoon in mid-April, a thunderstorm rolled in over the hills, and the electricity blinked out for a moment before returning in a soft flicker. Claire used the lull to explore the east wing, a section of the estate she had mostly left untouched. Many of the rooms were still draped in dust cloths, smelling faintly of mothballs and old cedar. She wandered slowly, fingertips grazing doorframes, as if the walls might speak if she was quiet enough. One room at the end of the corridor was locked, but the key was already in the door. She turned it. Inside was a study unlike the others, smaller, more personal. A faded quilt was folded neatly over the arm of a reading chair, a teacup, cracked but intact, sat in the windowsill, and on the desk a wooden box with brass hinges. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them. She read through several quickly, realizing they were all written by Alina. They were dated across nearly 2 decades. Some were long and aching, others no more than a few lines. None had been mailed. The one on top was dated only a few months before Walter's death. Walter, if I write, it's not because I forgive you, it's because the not knowing is worse than the grief. You left without saying goodbye, and maybe that's the part I will never quite let go of. We were never brave at the same time. Maybe that was our curse. Maybe love is just timing after all. I hope you found someone to hold your hand when you needed it most. Claire's hands trembled as she folded the letter again. She had been that someone, without knowing, without understanding why it had been her. That evening she handed the letter to Julian across the dinner table. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, a subtle moment, but it left a warmth trailing up her arm. He read in silence. I didn't know she ever wrote to him, he said eventually. She didn't send any of them, but he kept them, all of them. Julian leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes had softened. I used to think my father didn't feel anything, that he'd walled himself off so tightly that nothing could reach him. Claire took a sip of her wine. He felt everything, he just didn't know how to live with it. Julian looked at her for a long moment. And you, what are you still living with? The question caught her off guard, but she didn't turn away from it. I lost someone a few years ago, she said. He had cancer, he was younger than Walter. We were together for 5 years, I thought I'd have more time. Julian's expression didn't shift, but something in the air between them did. I left nursing for a while after he died, Claire continued. I thought maybe if I stopped caring for other people, it wouldn't hurt so much to have lost him. But you came back. I did, because even grief didn't stop me from knowing that people deserve to be seen in their final hours. And maybe because I wanted to believe that love could still mean something, even if it ended. Julian didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. You're not what I expected. Neither are you, she said. The next morning, Claire found a note slipped under her door. Come to the greenhouse, there's something you should see. She dressed quickly and made her way down the path, the early light catching on dew-dappled leaves. Julian was there, kneeling in the corner, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands. Around him were trays of young rose plants, freshly pruned and waiting for planting. These were Alina, he said, standing as she approached. She started them years ago. I didn't even know they were still alive. He looked at her then not just with curiosity but with something else, something open. I thought maybe we could finish what she started. Claire smiled together. Julian nodded if you're still staying. She stepped closer, slipping off her shoes to feel the soil beneath her feet. I think I am. They worked side by side, neither of them speaking much, letting the silence hold them. As they planted the roses, hands brushing now and then, Claire felt something inside her shift, not a grand change, just a loosening, a quiet kind of hope. It was never about the estate, she realized, not really. It was about the echoes of a life half-lived and whether that echo could become something whole again, not for Walter and Alina, but for those left behind. She pressed her fingers into the earth and thought, maybe love wasn't just what we lost. Maybe it was what we chose to return to. By the time the wisteria bloomed along the estate walls, Claire had been living there for nearly 3 months. The days had grown longer, softened by sunlight and birdsong, and the garden, once a quiet memory of what had been, now buzzed with new life. The roses had taken root. Some mornings she woke to the scent of them drifting through the open windows, mingling with the faint trace of old wood and summer rain. She had not made a formal decision to stay, and yet she hadn't left, not even once. Her shoes had taken to the gravel paths. Her sweaters hung beside Julian's in the hall closet. Lyndon no longer followed her nervously, but slept at the foot of her bed, snoring through the early hours like he had always belonged there. She had written to Alina, just a few lines, mostly to say that Walter had left something behind, not a house or a legacy, but a kindness, a connection, a beginning. Alina had written back. It was a short letter, graceful, grateful. She didn't ask for more, and Claire didn't offer it. Some things were better left in the hush between memories and the present. Alina had found her peace in that bookshop by the sea. She had no need to revisit the ache. But Claire did. One afternoon, she and Julian opened the final locked room. It had been Walter's music room, long since abandoned. The piano, though dusty, still held its sound. Claire ran her fingers across the keys and struck a soft chord, its echo rising through the silence like breath. Julian watched from the doorway, his arms crossed lightly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He never played after my mother died, he said. She was the musician, he just listened. Claire struck another chord, then we'll listen now. They sat in that room until the light shifted gold. Neither played, but the silence became a kind of music all its own, the kind made by presence, by knowing someone was there and choosing to stay. Later that evening, Claire stood at the window of her room, hers now, not just borrowed, and watched as Julian lit the lanterns along the garden path. The glow shimmered in the leaves, casting dancing shadows that reached up toward the open sky. He moved without hurry, his movements sure, as if he too had stopped waiting to live. She remembered what he had asked her weeks ago, what are you still living with? The truth was she had lived with grief, with the weight of what could not be saved, but now she was learning to live with something else, gentleness. A kind of joy that didn't rush in all at once but filled her like light gathering in a quiet room. The next morning, Julian handed her an envelope over breakfast. It was the final letter from the solicitor, confirming the end of her formal role as steward of the estate. It's official, he said, you're free to go. Claire sipped her coffee, am I? He tilted his head, are you asking me or yourself? She smiled, both maybe. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet stretch. You know, my father once told me he believed some people are meant to be found at the end of things. Claire raised an eyebrow, what do you mean? He said the ones who walk in at the end, when the walls are crumbling, when the light is fading, they're the ones who matter most. Because they choose you without promise, without a future, just presence. Claire felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. She simply looked at him and he looked back. I think you were that person for him, Julian said softly, and I think you might be that person for me too. The wind moved through the garden just then, lifting the curtains gently as if the house itself had exhaled. She reached across the table, not boldly, but with the same quiet courage that had carried her through so many endings. And this time into a beginning. Julian took her hand. There was no declaration, no sudden kiss, no promise etched in certainty, just the warmth of skin against skin. A breath shared between two people who had known absence and now chose presence. That evening they walked through the garden beneath a sky blooming with stars. Claire's hand in Julian's, the roses brushing softly against their legs, the lanterns glowing like tiny suns in the dusk. The estate, once full of ghosts and grief, now held something else entirely. Hope not loud or boastful, just steady, earned. A nurse had held a dying man's hand. And in the life that followed, she had found someone reaching back.